America, and welcome to another Founders Friday on the Glenn Beck program. Somebody asked me just before we went on the air how these shows are being rated, and I have to tell you, we didn't think anybody would watch. We thought, we'll give this a whirl, see if everybody wants to watch it. They're wildly highly rated, and I thank you for watching. There is a hunger in America for the truth, and tonight, I think we're going to blow your mind. You're going to have to ask yourself a couple of questions by the end of the program. Why would our schools leave all of this history out? I mean, this is some of the greatest American story that you've ever heard. Why would they do that? And it's everywhere. You just don't know where to look. If you take a look at the revolutionary paintings of revolutionary times, here it is. It's the Boston Tea Party. Bunch of white guys, and then these people strangely looking like Indians, and they're not. But that's it. Not a lot of racial diversity. If you watch movies, one great movie. This is John Adams. You watch John Adams, and you don't see a lot of racial diversity. I'm currently watching Johnny Tremaine. This is. I love this movie. I remember this growing up. I was watching it with my kids just last night, and I noticed there are a couple of American Indians, but you don't see any African Americans unless they're slaves. They will show people as slaves, but that's it. Now, I want to show you a painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunch of white guys, right? Unless you know where to look. Right here. That's Peter Salem. He was actually the hero of the battle. It doesn't look like he's a hero there. He looks like he's cowering behind the white guy with a sword. He was the hero of the battle. And he saved scores of American lives that day. Why don't we know this? Look at the picture of the Battle of Lexington. 150 Americans. There it is. Do you see any faces of color in this painting? They were all members of the Reverend Jonas Clark's church. They went out. They were actually, if I'm not mistaken, David, they were in church at the time, right?
He called them together at church,
okay,
yes.
Okay, so we called together at church and then said, let's go! And they went to defend their town. When the shot heard around the world was over that day, there were 18 Americans lying on the ground. What you don't see in this painting are the equal numbers of whites and blacks. They were white and black patriots. It was a mixed church. Did you even know that happened? One of those injured patriots on the ground in this painting was a black man named Prince Estabrook. I bet you never heard of Prince Estabrook before. How about the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware? Bunch of white guys, right? No. Look here, African American, helping row the boat across. You know what his name was? Prince Whipple. He fought alongside Washington during the Revolution. Take a look at this one, this painting of, this is the Marquis de Lafayette. If you look at this, you just think, oh yeah, and then he made his slave dress up like I don't know what. But that's what you would think, right? This guy is incredibly important. This guy may have won the Revolutionary War. James Armistead was his name. How did he win the Revolutionary War? Double spy. I'm going to let David tell the story here in a minute, but basically the Brits thought that he was spying for them, but he was spying for General Washington. He'd give the Brits bad intel and reveal the good critical information to General Washington. Did you know this story? Why? I'm so tired of people saying, well, it was just the white people, white people, white people. No. No. Why are we intentionally leaving others out? There are black founders. Let me ask the audience. How many of you can name one person of these pictures? Only one. How many can name only one? Most people, right? Am I mistaken saying it's Frederick Douglass? Okay. How many can name two of the people here? We've got 6, 8 people. How many can name 3? 4. How many can name 4? 1. And that's David Barton's wife. David, come on up. This is our good friend David Barton. He is the founder and president of Wall Builders, also author of Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White. Come on up and sit here. We also have Lucas Morell. Lucas is a professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. Welcome. And he is also the author of Lincoln's Sacred Effort. Okay. David, where do we start? Maybe we should start with
James Armistead.
Yeah, the spy.
It's a great one, because James Armistead, after the Battle of Richmond, he's in Virginia, and a lot of the battles do not happen in Virginia. But after the siege of Richmond, he's there. He sees what the British have done in his home state, and he goes to enlist. He said, "I want to help." And he really, I don't know why, but he liked Lafayette. He went to Lafayette, young French general, 19 years old, said, "I want to fight with you." And so they make this agreement, and what happens is James Armistead goes over to Benedict Arnold's camp. He's a British general then, traitor British general. And he says, "Oh, these mean Americans, they mistreat me. I've escaped as a slave. Please let me stay with you." And Arnold says, "Okay, you can wait on us." And so he is part of Benedict Arnold's staff, waiting on Benedict Arnold. And Arnold's one of the generals, which means he meets with all the other generals. So he's meeting with Cornwallis all the time. And so James Armistead is just serving them and doing all the right stuff and just picking up intelligence like crazy. Every day he gets back with Lafayette, says, "Here's what they're doing. Here's where they're going. Here's what they're going to do next." And kept feeding the information back. And Cornwallis in this time got really comfortable with James and said, "You know, I don't want to ask you to do something you don't want to do, but would you consider being a spy against your former guys there, the Americans? Would you be a British spy and tell us what they're doing?" He said, "Yeah, I guess if you want me to, I will. You know, if you're going to force me to, I will." So he goes back.
It'd be tough getting across the lines, though, but I'll risk it for you.
I'll try it.
Right.
So he ends up saying, "Yeah, I'll do it." And what happens is when they leave Richmond, they decide that they're going down to Yorktown, and they're going to go down there. So what happens is Armistead's fed all that information to Washington and Lafayette. They're going to Yorktown. And he's let the British know that, oh, there's no Americans around down there. It's a real safe place to go. The Americans are elsewhere. So the British the British fleet drops the soldiers off in Yorktown, and the fleet takes off because there's no Americans around. Right then, the French fleet came in and blockaded the port, so the British couldn't get their ships back. And now we've got all the American troops waiting for them when he got up. They're pinned in on the peninsula. Can't go anywhere. So he probably cut months, maybe years off the revolution by what he did. Now, it's really cool. He liked Lafayette so much that he went back and got his name changed legally from James Armistead to James Lafayette. He loved Lafayette. And so Lafayette left America in 1784, went back to France. He came back here in 1824 for his farewell tour. Last time he's going to be in America. He's an old man. There's a painting of Lafayette that hangs inside the House chambers, the U.S. Congress, of Lafayette, the old man, on his farewell tour. And everywhere Lafayette went, there were hundreds of thousands of Americans lining the roads. When he went through Richmond 40 years later, he looked over and spotted his old friend James right in the crowd. Picked him out, called him by name. They went and hugged and embraced, and it was really cool.
Why do we not know this story, because really, you talk to African Americans, and they'll say, "Well, I mean, I think I had Al Sharpton say this to me. Well, you give me somebody like Rosa Parks up there. He said this about these three gentlemen.
Yeah.
Get rid of all the white guys. You give me somebody like Rosa Parks up there. Why don't you have any color there?" And that's what prompted this show. There is. Why leave people like this out?
Let me give you an example of how well we used to know this. You know, the painting you showed of Washington crossing the Delaware, this little jewel right here. You mentioned that this is Oliver Cromwell, and he is. But up here are Prince Whipple, but the other one's Oliver Cromwell. There's actually two blacks in the front of that boat, and they served not as slaves. They were free men who served with Washington on the general staff throughout the Revolution from start to finish. Now, this painting that you showed was done in 1851 by a German, and it was done in Europe. It wasn't done in America. It was done in Europe to show the Europeans, here's what the American Revolution looked like, which meant back then we knew blacks were involved, whites were involved. At the back of the boat, there's actually a lady dressed up in men's clothes.
Put this back up. Put the George Washington crossing the Delaware over, because I find it interesting, because I looked into the history of this as well.
See, they believe what he did was. Go ahead.
I heard this is the lady, but who are you saying?
Right there, right there. That's the lady.
Right here.
Right there.
Yeah,
and the two guys up front, the very front guy, Oliver Cromwell, and you pointed to Prince Whipple behind him. There. I mean, this was done to show Europe, hey, here's what America did in the Revolution.
Right.
Everybody came together. We don't show that today. I mean, it used to be that we knew. This book right here is an old textbook from 1855. It's a great book. It's written by a black historian, a first black appointed federal office. It's called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Now, we studied that as a textbook. That is not a skinny little book that we have there. I mean, there's a lot of patriots in the American Revolution that we studied. Black patriots.
I read the book Giants and was just amazed at this man, Frederick Douglass. Incredible guy. We don't really even know. Most people can say, I think the audience would say, yeah, I can reckon. I know that's Frederick Douglass, but you're not really sure. He looks kind of just like a black Alexander Graham Bell. I mean, you're like, I don't really know his story, I think. Am I right saying that or not? You kind of know him, but you're not sure why.
Right.
Tell his story.
We've got a movie about Malcolm X. Right? Movies about Martin Luther King Jr. And for some reason in American history, we think that the only time blacks stood up for their rights was when Martin Luther King decided to leave the pulpit and hit the stump, hit the stump to make speeches. The bottom line is, for the longest time, we've adopted this victim narrative about blacks in the United States, that the only role they played was a victim to white majority oppression. When I teach my course on Black American politics, I always stress to my students that when we talk about King and the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, we need to call it the modern civil rights movement, because blacks from before the revolution were prudently pressing for their rights. American history could be described as one long civil rights struggle. Our first Emancipation Proclamation, Declaration of Independence.
Right.
That's right.
It's been this way. It's going on now. It's going on. It's people trying to grab others' rights, and that never changes. That's human history.
Nature.
That's human history. If I ask the audience, when did America have its first African American judge? What year would you say? Anybody? Take a guess. Judge. 1860s? Anybody? 1770. Amy, is that just a wild guess?
No, it's not. I wasn't sure exactly, but I think it's about
1770. Tell me.
1768. Wentworth Cheswell, New Hampshire, elected to office in New Hampshire. He was reelected for the next 49 years, held 8 different political positions. Really cool story about him is we all know that Paul Revere made his midnight ride. We also know he wasn't the only guy riding that night. Another guy riding, Wentworth Cheswell, black and white riding.
Now, how is it possible? Did you know that we had an African-American ride to say the British are coming, the British are coming? Amy did. Amy did. Anybody else besides Amy know that? 2, 3. Okay, 3 people in the audience. He was such a great guy, and we never hear about him because he rode north and Paul Revere rode west. And Revere was going after Reverend Jonas Clark's church because that's where Hancock and Adams were, was him. And that's where we had blacks and whites, as you pointed out, laying on the ground after that battle. Wentworth Cheswell rode north telling people the British are coming. And it was from the north that all those people came to Boston to take on the British at Bunker Hill and everywhere else. So we don't hear about his ride because the British went west, and that's where all the action happened. But it was a couple of days later when all these people started coming down from New Hampshire and Vermont and elsewhere, and that's where he had ridden, telling them what was up. Lucas, when we come back, I want to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want you to tell me a little bit about about Frederick Douglass. Sure. You know, the opening of Giants is so captivating, where you see a man who has struggled, who was kept. I mean, it sounds horrible to say, but kept in, I guess, nice slavery, if there's such a thing. How would you describe how he...
Well, he didn't grow up as a slave in the deep South, the deep cotton states. So, I mean, the phrase being sold down the river, that has an actual historical connection. To be sold down the river was the worst thing because you went from something pretty bad to awfully bad.
Right, okay.
So a slave in Maryland is not as bad as being a slave down in the Delta.
And what happened to his family where he was originally held? Because they sold him.
They sold him. He never knew his siblings, met his mother, or had vague memories of his mother maybe a few times. He remembers her calling him my little Valentine, and that's why he dates his birthday February 14th, but he doesn't have a birth certificate. He doesn't know when he was born.
Okay.
We think February 1818.
Okay, so he was in, a slavery that was northern slavery, but then he was sold into horrible, horrible conditions, and he witnessed for the first time somebody's whipping him, and he's like, whoa, 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 what is this all about? And it wasn't too much longer that he's sitting and having a conversation with Abraham Lincoln because he was so impressive. We'll tell you that story coming up in just a second. Tonight, we are talking about the founders and the black founders, and I think Frederick Douglass is a refounder. And we need more refounders. There are black founders. There are people that were here and played instrumental roles in the American idea and experiment. To learn more about all the founders, go to glennbeck.com and sign up for Insider Extreme. Check out the rock stars of the revolution, the 5 things you didn't know about our black founding fathers. Available at glennbeck.com. Sign up for Extreme, and you get the documentaries and everything else that are part of that. All right, back with me now, David Barton, founder of and president of Wall Builders, and Lucas Morel. He is the professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. We're talking a little bit about Frederick Douglass, and I just want to, I would like the thrust of this show to be able to have African Americans watch this and say, oh, wait a minute, hang on, I haven't been told the truth. This is my country. There's such a disconnect prior to Abraham Lincoln. It's like the country for African Americans maybe was founded here, but that's not true. We have a man who was born in slavery, didn't know his family, horrible life, sold to another family. He's being whipped, and he doesn't even understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong, or if you can fill in any of the blanks. He doesn't even understand it. He's like, what are you doing? And whip him, whip him, whip him, try to break him. He runs away. He's sent back. Now they whip him within an inch of his life. He finally actually breaks the master, if I'm not mistaken.
The slave breaker, right.
Right, yeah. I think he's sold to another family where he finally is emancipated. Is that, I'm trying to remember this.
Well, he escapes for a second time. You're right. He tried to escape in 1836, I believe, and was caught in prison for a while, sent back, and then 2 years later just decides to try it again, rather die fighting for his freedom than to continue living as a slave, and he succeeds in 1838.
Now, how does he, where does he go from there? How does he make this transition from slave to
here's a fellow who he gets in close with the Anti-Slavery Association, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and becomes a lecturer. And the story about that is his English is so good, people start saying there's no way Frederick Douglass could have been a slave because he speaks the King's English. I mean, it's so eloquent. He publishes his very famous now narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1845 to rave reviews, has to flee the country because he names names, his masters. What he doesn't do is he names the whites who helped him, because he wants to continue the Underground Railroad, as it were, for it to be successful. In fact, he's very critical of those who've been bragging about how they got out in this and that way. And he's like, look, you're not doing your brothers a favor here. So he has to flee to England, goes on tour there for 2 years, and it's British friends of his, with maybe a few Americans, who pay for him to be free so that he can return to the United States in 1847.
Okay, so he comes back. He takes a trip to Washington, D.C. I think he meets a general. I'm sorry, I'm so fuzzy on some of these details. I meant to brush up before I went on, and so I'm pulling this out of my memory here. But he goes to Washington. I think he meets a general, and the general is so impressed with him, says, you should serve. You should serve. And he says, absolutely, which was, if I'm not mistaken, unheard of at the time. And the general is so impressed, he says, you need to meet the president. And he walks him to the White House, where he sits and they talk for 3 hours, and they become friends.
This is the summer, this is August of 1863, the year of Jubilee, right? Emancipation, January 1st, 1863. He's there to complain to the president. He's one of Lincoln's fiercest critics, although a supporter, but one keeping Lincoln honest here. Now that he's got freedmen and free blacks serving in the Union Army and the Navy, he wants them to have equal pay. He wants them to be treated equally, get all the same treatment that white soldiers get. And Lincoln explains to him, look, we're just barely getting the country used to the idea of blacks serving in the military, let alone paying them equally. He makes the governor of Connecticut wait out in the hall. Twice they come in and say, Mr. President, the governor of Connecticut is out here, and he says, I want to talk to my friend Frederick Douglass here. Meets with Douglass next year, August of '64. What's happening then? The war going very poorly. Lincoln, on record, does not believe he's going to be reelected. So why is he meeting with Frederick Douglass? Not just Frederick Douglass, but a second meeting, another meeting with Martin Delany, another black intellectual of the day. One plan. He says, McClellan gets elected, the Emancipation Proclamation is going out the window. You guys need to help me spirit as many slaves as possible across Union lines, because after March 4th, 1865, I will be no help to you. Thankfully, he gets that great telegram from Sherman in September. Atlanta is ours and fairly won. And, of course, everybody's like, oh, I'm not against the war. I'm for the war. The war's going great. I'm for it.
Boy, we
wins.
haven't changed it all.
Yeah.
Jeez.
That's right.
We are just little worms. So,
but some of us are glowworms, to quote Winston Churchill.
All right, so there he is, but he goes back to meet and meet with Lincoln again later. And he's kept away from Lincoln. Yeah,
after the second inaugural address, Douglass was there. He sees it, and he figures, hey, there's a reception. There's no reason why I, an American citizen, can't see this elected president. He goes to the door, and they say, no colored people are allowed. And he says, there's no way that that order emanated from Mr. Lincoln. And so they say, okay, fine, come with me. So the two security guys bring Douglass in and then escort him out a window. They had planks on this window there were so many people at the reception, they needed to find a way for them to get out. And he gets escorted out the window.
Wouldn't that be great if we could put those planks back up and we could escort people out the window?
So he walks the plank, and he finally gets word back to Lincoln. Lincoln sends for him. He comes across this great ballroom, the East Room, and he says, there's my friend, Mr. Douglass. Douglass comes to him, and Lincoln says to him, there's no man in this country whose opinion I value more. What did you think of my speech? And he said, Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort. And that was the last time he saw him alive.
All right, I want to, I'm going to take a break, and then when I come back, I want to go back to the Revolutionary time, because African Americans played a critical role, And there is one thing that drives me out of my mind. I've heard presidents say it, and it is such a misjustice to our founders, such a miscast, and it cannot be anything other than intentional by people who are intelligent. But then again, I've seen how history has been distorted and changed. You may not even know the truth. Maybe I should give them the benefit of the doubt. They don't know the truth either. It is, I am only 3/5 of a man. And don't tell me about the founders. Let's correct that history. It is crucial to understanding, and it restores the founders and who they were. Back in a minute. You are going to learn more about our founders and the role that African Americans played in the founding of this country in the next 15 minutes than you probably have learned your entire life. Back with me is David Barton, founder and president of Wall Builders, and Lucas Morel. He is a professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. I want to go back to Frederick Douglass here, because Frederick Douglass actually was very upset at our founders, because he said, I'm not just 3/5 of a human being, I'm a full human being. This is an argument that is used even today that Frederick Douglass corrected.
Yes.
Tell me the story.
What happened was, after he escaped in 1838, he ended up in New York. In New York, he gets discipled by a lot of anti-slavery folks, and that's the Lysander Spooners and Gerrit Smith and William Lloyd Garrison, etc. And Massachusetts society hears him do his testimony, and they said, oh man, you got to speak for us. Well, in the meantime, they're saying, you know, you need to overthrow the Constitution, because the Constitution is a slavery document. The founders gave us slavery in the document, and there's all these clauses of slavery. And he believed that. But bless his heart, when the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society said, we want to pay you to go on the road full time, he said, okay, I got to make sure I know this stuff. So he sat down and read the Constitution for himself, not just what the guys had taught him. He read it himself, and he read the documents surrounding it, the debates going around it. And he comes out with this epiphany and says, this is a great anti-slavery document. And he says, every clause in it. You go, whoa, time out. How can the 3/5 clause be an anti-slavery clause? Real easy. He read the convention notes. What happened was, you had all these anti-slavery founding fathers. You had, for example, James Wilson. You had Elbridge Sherry. You had Luther Martin.
Ben Franklin.
All these guys, all these anti-slavery guys. And you had 3 hardcore southern states that were pro-slavery. There's Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And so the Constitution says every 30,000 inhabitants you have, you get a representative to the House of Representatives. And in South Carolina and Georgia, there's more blacks than there are whites, and they're slaves. And they said, great, every 30,000 slaves we've got, we'll get another member of Congress. Guys up north said, no, 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 we're not doing that. If you want to count them, you free them. Every free person you have, you can get 30,000. You can have, and they said, no, no, we're going to count this, or we're not going to be part of these United States. So this debate goes back and forth. And what's really funny is the guys in the South said, you know, blacks are property. I love.
They're not people.
They're not people,
but they want to count them as people.
And see, the guys in the North said, no, every black is equal to a white. We're all created equal. You get 30,000 free blacks. You get a member of Congress, and that was the incentive to free blacks. It was, you get to count them for Congress. So the guys up north started having fun with the guys down south. They said, you know, you guys say that blacks are property, and Elbridge Gerry did this, and Luther Martin did it out of Maryland. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do up north: is you're counting 30,000 pieces of property, get a member of Congress. We're going to count 30,000 chairs and horses and cows. We'll count our property. Every 30,000 pieces of property we get an anti-slavery member to Congress. So they went back and forth on this thing, and what they finally ended up was the 3/5 clause that says, okay, we will count 3/5 of the slave population, not individuals, which meant you now had to have 50,000 before you could get a pro-slavery rep to Congress. The 3/5 clause cut the slavery representation in Congress in half. And when Frederick Douglass read that, he said, the 3/5 clause, that has nothing to do with the worth. That has to do with the representation. It makes it harder to get a pro-slavery representative in Congress. The Constitution's an anti-slavery document. And it was.
It was.
And
That's why they
Frederick
changed.
Douglass who points that out.
The original document for the Declaration of Independence was life, liberty, and property.
And property. That's right.
The reason being, they changed it. They changed it to pursuit of happiness because they didn't want the South to say,
That's right. The South.
You've got chairs, we've got people. By the way, all of these people here, most people, these pictures, most people cannot identify them, but they all played a role in the founding of our nation, or the refounding of our nation. These people are now in the textbooks because of Texas, because of what happened. These people, they fought to put these people in. Why would the left fight to put these people in?
Let me go back to the picture we had earlier of the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Okay.
So if you take that picture of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and this is a painting that was done in 1817, and the guy who did this, John Trumbull, did this painting. John Trumbull was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He's the guy who drew the maps for Washington, what went on. Over here on the right, we have Peter Salem. Now, he had 14 military commendations that day. He is the hero. They brought him in front of George Washington to get special honors from the commander-in-chief.
He's the guy standing behind the white guy with the sword.
That's right. Now, the white guy with the sword is Thomas Grosvenor. So you have Thomas Grosvenor and you have Peter Salem, black and white, fighting side by side. But Peter is definitely the hero that day. 1817, this painting is done, and all the way up until the 1980s, we knew that that was Peter Salem, the hero of Bunker Hill. 1980s, the professors got together and said, oh, no, that's not Peter Salem. We think that that's Grosvenor's slave is who that is. It's not Peter Salem.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, in the 80s, they changed that from Peter Salem to Grosvenor's slave, Asaba. And that's what they say, oh, no, it's not Peter, it's Asaba Grosvenor, it's his slave. How come the guy who painted it and the guy who was there and the guy who saw it and painted what he saw had him as Peter Salem, and now we've all convinced, oh, no, it's a slave? Because we're into this thing of the founders have got to be evil. We got to make every effort we can to make them. We got to make victims and everything. These guys weren't victims. They were courageous Americans who won the battle, and we can't afford to say that.
Okay.
That'd make America look good.
When did America have the first Speaker of the House?
1789.
Wow. Details next. Founders Fridays. This is lost history in America, and you need to preserve it. Back with me now is David Barton, founder and president of Wall Builders, and Lucas Morell, professor at Washington Lee University in Virginia. We're going to get to some questions in the audience here in a second. First, one thing that I think is missing in America, and it is the key to America, has been the difference between individual rights and collective rights. And this man articulated that.
In a speech entitled Our Composite Nationality, Frederick Douglass said, I know of no rights of color superior to the rights of humanity. He thought the worst thing that could happen for blacks after the Civil War was to treat them as exceptions in the law. And so today, with the discursive logjam that we have over things like affirmative action and group rights, and the only thing that you get from government is if you ally with others who look like you or somehow are categorized like you.
This goes into your theory that this is why this is not being taught, because you can't play the victim card. If you don't...
It goes against the traditional victim narrative.
Got it.
After the Civil War, the history was actually written by the losers. That's the one time in history where the losers wrote the history.
That's exactly right.
Really interesting perspective.
That's exactly right.
All right, David, explain quickly. Let's go through these people.
Let's go through these. This guy right here, this is Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes is a soldier in the American Revolution. He is a black preacher. He's the first black preacher ordained in America that was a pastor of a white congregation in Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, several places.
A black professor in
black
a
preacher,
white...
That's right, in a white church.
Yeah, black minister.
Black minister in a white church in 4 different states. He was ordained in the Congregationalist denomination in 1785. He's the first black to receive a master's degree in America. He got that in 1804 from Middlebury College. So Lemuel Haynes, every year on Washington's birthday, he preached a special sermon about George Washington, his commander-in-chief, in all of his churches where he was.
Unbelievable.
So we don't hear about Lemuel Haynes. This is Benjamin Banneker. I think he's the most brilliant scientist in American history. This guy, unbelievable what he did. He's the guy
more so than Franklin?
I would put Franklin and Banneker almost equal. Now, Franklin did a lot of inventions. This guy one time took a pocket watch. He taught himself how to read. He taught himself science. He wrote an almanac that 10 years ahead he was able to predict to the minute solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, 10 years before they happened. I mean, by watching the motion through a telescope, unbelievable what the guy did. He once took the back off a pocket watch, saw how it worked, went home and carved a wooden clock with all the gears, mainspring, and it was accurate to within 1 minute a year. A wooden clock the guy did.
Cow.
He's the guy who laid out Washington, D.C. He's the surveyor who did all that. He's a brilliant mathematician. Jefferson gave him...
Never knew this.
No. Jefferson gave him as an example to France, said, hey, you guys in France think that blacks are inferior? Here's Benjamin Banneker.
Okay, I have
Jefferson
2 minutes total, so quickly
right
there, and then we have one
Right
more.
here, James Armistead. We talked about the first double spy, really cool guy. This is Richard Allen. He's the first founder of a black denomination in America. He is a soldier in the American Revolution. He actually is the first guy to practice medicine, taught by sign of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Just a really cool story.
Okay.
So really cool.
All right, good. Now tell me...
Here to these guys.
Now let's take the full of the first representatives. I asked, when did we have our first black Speaker of the House? When did we have the first Speaker of the House? 1789. When did we have our first black Speaker of the House? I bet most people would say never.
Never. Except it was right here. Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina is first black to preside over the House of Representatives. These are the first 7 blacks elected to Congress. You have here Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first black U.S. Senator elected. He was a minister of the gospel. He was a missionary. He worked with Frederick Douglass. He recruited 3 regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War, and he was a missionary to slaves in the South. You have here Benjamin Benjamin Turner, Josiah Wall, the large. This guy right here is really cool. Robert Brown Elliott is probably the most brilliant guy of that era. He actually took on the vice president of the Confederacy in a debate on the floor and just tore his head off. The racist Alexander Stephens. It was a great debate.
When did we turn? Were these guys proud Americans, or did they say
this is the epitome of what we were just talking about. These were individual guys. Half of these guys taught themselves to read. Half of these guys were slaves, and 5 years later they're sitting in Congress. And as slaves, it was a capital offense to learn to read. So these guys in 5 years, and I'll guarantee you read their speeches and records of Congress, you better have a dictionary and thesaurus in both hands, because you want to understand the language they use. It is so brilliant what these guys did.
But were they there to say the white man is bad and the America is bad?
No. These guys were, Richard Allen, let me go back here. Richard Allen had been in slavery. Richard Allen was in slavery, and he held no bitterness at all. He says, God would not allow bitterness even in Joseph when he was in prison. Do you think God will allow it in us? He said, we can't have bitterness. He said, by the way, there were some whites who held us in slavery, but it's whites who are working for our freedom. I mean, these guys had no bitterness. They wouldn't allow it.
Back in just a second. Here is an easy book for you to read that will answer a lot of the questions. American History in Black and White by David Barton. Available at Wall Builders, also Amazon.com and everything else. Yeah, grab it now. David Barton is here, founder and president of Wall Builders. Lucas Morrell, professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. Deneen has a question in our audience.
Yeah, when did this rich history get erased from the textbooks?
Lucas hit it. The losers wrote the history. I mean, that's exactly what happened. Was the loser wrote. You really set something, put it together for me, because my viewpoint was, and you're going to love this. This is red meat for you. Woodrow Wilson changed the teaching of history. So
hate that guy.
Woodrow Wilson, when he came into office, he took every black in office in federal government and kicked them all out except one. He left one black in office. He is the first guy.
He resegregated the army.
He resegregated. He's the first guy to show a film at the White House, and the film he showed was Birth of a Nation, a Klan recruiting film.
He called it History Written with Lightning.
That's right.
The NAACP, to their credit, boycotted that movie.
That's right. So he's the guy who wrote the 7-volume History of the American People. And that is the set that suddenly became the whole basis of the way we started teaching 20th century history. It's racist.
Oh, it's awful.
But
he has a PhD.
Bingo.
Rafiq.
Can you please explain to the audience that Texas is working to put this in their history books, is not trying to take out black history as the hype propagated by the media?
Yeah, the media doesn't like what we're doing. I was one of the 6 guys appointed in Texas to help oversee the writing, the standards, one of the experts, and we got every one of these guys back in, and it drives the left crazy.
Back in.
Yeah, back in. Back in. And you know, I love what you said, too, about groups versus individuals, because if you look at the American Revolution, not only was it black and white, guess what? We had a lot of Hispanic heroes as well. And it is such a good group. And the national motto is E pluribus unum. Out of many, we became one. And we have tried for 20 years to make it E unum pluribus. Out of one, we're going to be all these groups. And it's back.
Yes.
Good.
Well, what is the motivation behind not disseminating this information? What's the motivation behind the left or whoever it is that doesn't want this information put into the textbooks?
Well, their mentality is that you get what is secure if government gives it to you. The Declaration of Independence says your rights are not the gift of government. You are born with them. You are endowed by your Creator with these. Government exists to protect what you already possess. That is counter 180 degrees to what the typical statist approach to government exists.
It really is slavery again. And you just start with the easiest to enslave, but it eventually ends in all of us being enslaved.
It's a plantation mentality.
Yeah. Okay. Justice, go ahead.
How have these revelations on the Black Founding Fathers personally affected your viewpoints on the American government and society today?
I have to tell you, I didn't grow up in the civil rights movement. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and so I've always kind of just approached it as everybody's, you know, hey, everybody has a fair shot. And I was one of your more uninformed people on planet Earth. In learning about the founders and seeing the heroes that were involved, it only strengthens my view that this was a divine document, the Declaration of Independence, that these guys really did struggle, just like in any society at any time. Bad guys, good guys. There were some real dirtbags. But for the most part, these guys were amazing, and they struggled in their time to do the right thing. You say that they're not Christians. They were Christians, and they fought for people who weren't. The same thing with, they were all white. Well, they fought for people who weren't. It was a confusing time, but an amazing time. Thanks. Back in a second. I was just thinking about Justice's question before the break, and the other thing that I've learned is I'm really hacked off because there were amazing people that have been forgotten. Remember them from New York. Good night, America. So who wants to start? Robin, yeah, go ahead. We'll start with you again.
I just want to say, what is this anti-American sentiment that's going on? Like, why is it in vogue to not be
Woodrow
a patriot
Wilson.
or not to be
Wouldn't you say?
patriotic?
Well, he didn't like the founders. He didn't like the Constitution.
He didn't like the country.
Yeah.
And that's
Why didn't he go
Europe.
back to Europe?
Europe.
So
He
what?
wanted
Parliamentary system.
He wanted Europe.
How precisely did Woodrow Wilson become lionized by the progressive movement? He was the professor. He was president of Princeton.
He was president of Princeton.
Of Princeton University.
Governor of New York.
Democrat. An avowed racist. How exactly did all of this get expunged from history and he became sort of lionized?
Let me go get a document real quick. Can I step off and get a document? Let me grab a document.
You know, it's really amazing how. I just heard somebody talking about Mexico. Who was it? Somebody in the administration. They were talking about.
They've named scholarships for minorities after this man.
Oh.
And it's infuriating when you think about it.
I was just in a school.
I studied public policy, and I was I went to school with others that had this scholarship. I didn't get it, but others did.
Did you know who he was?
Not at that time.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was just in Salt Lake City, and I about had a car accident because I'm passing the Woodrow Wilson Elementary School.
Yeah.
I wanted to go in and take all the letters off. It's
Yeah.
Right. Wilson School.
Wait.
These scholarships
Public
for minorities.
for public affairs.
For public affairs.
Public affairs. This is
propaganda.
This is propaganda.
Yeah.
If you read Goebbels' diary, okay, everybody knows that Hitler and the Nazis and Goebbels was the best. Read Goebbels' words. Goebbels says, "We lost to Woodrow Wilson. They had a better propaganda machine." That's why it's public affairs. He was a genius on propaganda.
Yeah.
Evil, just evil.
This thing right here, this is a card from 1868 put out by the Ku Klux Klan. That card right there from 1868 has 63 faces on it. On the back, it gives you the name so you know who you're supposed to kill. This is the hit card from the Klan from 1868. Now, what's interesting is it has 50 blacks and 13 whites on the Klan hit list. The reason is the Klan was started in 1868 with one stated purpose, and that was to destroy Republicans. Turns out any black you killed was a Republican. You just couldn't be sure about whites. Some might be Democrats. So that's why there were 4,800 lynched by the Klan, 1,300 whites. There were 3,500 blacks. But the whole thing was blacks were all Republicans, 100%. First 190 blacks elected in South Carolina were all Republican. First 112 in Mississippi. First 137 in Louisiana. I mean, it's unbelievable. So that's where the Democrats side Wilson as a racist because they were racist.
Right. But you know, if you look at the history, it was the Republicans that changed it. Now, that's not to excuse Republicans who
not
say
today.
that. Not at all.
Yeah.
Because now a lot of them are progressives.
That's
It's
right.
the
That's right.
progressive
That's right.
movement that the evil came out of.
And
again, you don't know this because Wilson was a propaganda expert.
That's right.
Justice.
Would you label yourself as conservative? Is a part of the question.
Conservative libertarian.
Okay. Given the political views of the country today, there's raised a socioeconomic class where race is oftentimes attributed with class and therefore with politics. You mentioned the Ku Klux Klan was initiated in order to execute Republicans, and in essence there was race attributed with Republicans. All blacks are Republicans. In today's politics and in American government, what role would you say race and this this striking of African American founding fathers plays in decision making.
I am, and at first I found out we picked 828 to be down at the Lincoln Memorial, and I'm going to give a speech, and we're also going to be awarding, for the first time I think since Washington, the Purple Heart of Merit, what it was originally intended, for people who are unbelievable that are with us today. When I first picked 828, we picked it on the calendar because it was just the day that I had open and everybody had open.
You didn't know?
Didn't know it.
King's speech?
Didn't know it. King's speech happened on August 28th. Sheer coincidence.
Wow.
When I found out, I looked at one of my business partners. I said, "Oh dear God, we're going to get killed." Okay. As it turns out, I think it was a miracle.
Yeah,
I think
perfect.
it was
That's
by
perfect.
divine providence,
Yeah.
because
Perfect.
here's the answer to your question. It is time for Republicans and Democrats
That's right.
to stop playing black and white
Yeah.
and start concentrating on the content of character, on
Yeah.
merit, not color.
That's right.
Period.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Who else? Yes.
Just a quick comment on Crispus Attucks. He perhaps was the first American killed in the Revolutionary War, and we don't know. Most people don't know that he was a black man.
I have heard from African Americans who say, "Oh, you're going to do a show on African American Revolution. Don't tell me the Crispus Attucks story. I've heard it enough. That's your whole show, isn't it?"
That's why we left him off today.
Yeah, he's like, I think is he still even taught?
He's the only one from the founding era that I've seen taught in public textbooks for the last 40 years, is Crispus Attucks. Nobody else.
Larry, did you know this stuff? Did you know this stuff?
My grandfather was the person who helped me with Douglas. When I grew up as 12 years old, he always used to talk about him and Booker T. Washington. That's the only ones I ever heard about when I was growing up.
Booker T. Washington's been written out of the record.
Yeah,
He
right.
is persona non grata. Believe me.
He's gone now?
There is no center at Harvard named
Wrong
Booker
philosophy.
T. Washington Center for the Study of Anything. It's the Du Bois
That's
Center.
right.
That debate is long gone, and thank God for Jeff Norrell, who published Up From History. You got to get him on your show. He is bringing Washington back to the.
Up
I
From
think
History is
Up From History is an awesome biography. It will teach you about America. Forget Washington. It'll teach you about what America was like at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
Talk about living in the lion's mouth.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Up in the back and then down here. Yeah, up in the back.
If you ever say to like a Democrat, for instance, you know, that the Democrat Party was actually the party fighting for slavery, their typical response is no. Well, in the 30s, obviously the parties completely switched with the critical realignment. And then you read and you kind of realize that the parties didn't really switch. There wasn't really much of a switching.
Yeah.
And more so, the Democratic Party kind of just promised all of these things to blacks to shore up
Yeah.
their political authority.
Lip service,
So
yeah.
how much accuracy is really in that, and when the realignment happened in the 30s, and what is actually can be said about what happened?
Let
in
me
the
give you
30s
an
in
example of
realignment?
how realignment didn't happen in the 30s. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill and 1965 Voting Rights Act are the big things they point to. Both of those were written by Republicans, first by Eisenhower in 57, then again by Eisenhower in 59. It was the Democrat head of the Judiciary Committee that kept it from going through in the House and the Senate. We had talk about it, and actually JFK brought up Eisenhower's bills in 61, tried to get it. Then when he was killed, he gave a speech in 63 in Birmingham. Then he's killed, and then LBJ brings it up. So at the time he finally gets Eisenhower's bills to the floor for a vote, at that time in the House and the Senate, out of 535 House and Senate members, it takes a simple majority to get something done, 269. Democrats had 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. No-brainer. They can pass this bill without any Republican support, and having 2/3 of the House and Senate, they could not marshal enough support to pass either the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act of 64-65. Only 62% of the 2/3 voted for that. It was actually the Republicans who voted about 83% for it, and had it not been for Republicans voting for Eisenhower's bill, you don't get either one of those. So realignment.
Do you know
didn't
why
happen.
they included women in the Civil Rights Act of 64? To kill the bill. To kill the bill. Hugh Davis Graham's history on this is, he says they put it in there because they said, oh, This is a slam dunk. There's no way this bill's going to get passed now, but the momentum had built up too much.
And then you pick up again the Walter Lippmann. Remember, Walter Lippmann was part of the propaganda machine from Wilson. You pick that machine up, which is now in all of the broadcasts, all of the journalist schools, and it's all erased. Right. It's all erased. Yep. Matt, what? And then 2 more questions. Go ahead, Matt.
Glenn, on one of your shows, you had Martin Luther King Jr.'s granddaughter.
No, niece.
Niece.
I'll be there. Mm-hmm.
I was so floored when I watched that show about her opinions about the black movement and where it's gone now.
There's a huge split.
And when I listen to self-proclaimed black leaders, especially from this New York metropolitan area, and how different their rhetoric is versus what her statements were, and it's so uncomfortable, especially in this area, to even try to broach the subject, to say, well, you can't talk about that. You're white. You're racist. I want to talk about the conversation.
Why do you think they do that, Matt?
Because it's easier to just ignore the conversation and just accept the status quo than to try to.
It is. If you can call each other racist
then you
and
have
make
to talk
you
about
afraid,
the facts.
Then you can't communicate to each other.
And I
They
will
keep
tell
you
you,
silent.
I sat there in my office the next day, and we have people in our office of different colors and nationalities and everything, talking about, and nobody but my office saw that episode, and I was like, you have to find her. You have to talk about this
she's
issue.
amazing.
I was floored by that.
I love her.
It amazes me.
Go ahead, yes.
No, what I was going to say is that liberal Democrats didn't jump on the civil rights train until it became politically convenient to do so. And the irony is the LBJ and JFK are lauded in the black community, but they didn't support the Civil Rights Act of 1957.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, that's right.
And you know what's really interesting to me is we're doing the same thing now with Hispanics. I mean, what what Mexicans are going through here is the modern-day slave trade without the whips. It is abhorrent, and they're intentionally keeping people from reading English. They want to keep people from being able to speak. It's the slave trade all over again, and who's doing it? Who's pushing it? Who's pushing it? Big business. Might as well be cotton. Big business, and those people who just want to hold on to their power. And right now, it's the Democrats. Go ahead, George.
2 quickies. First of all, thank you for giving me a bunch of heroes I can now look up to. That I didn't know about.
Thank you. They're great, aren't they?
And secondly, why don't you make these shows an hour and a half or 2 hours?
You'd have got to eat. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thanks. Great episode.
Thanks, bro.